Hi guys, it's Matt here from MCS-books, and today I'm going to be talking about books and cinema and the relationship between literature and film in a way that I kind of haven't really talked about on this channel before, with some books that are a really nice mix, yet I think I have a lot of interesting things to say perhaps about their relationship with cinema. For those of you who perhaps are new to my channel, when I did my undergrad at the University of York, I did writing, directing and performance for theatre, film and television, and my preference was studying cinema. And since then, since starting my booktube channel, I have made a few videos in regards to sort of book to movie adaptations, in which I took a book that I perhaps didn't enjoy so much and then took a film director that I absolutely loved and talked about how that film director could make that book a better film, which I'll link to the playlist down below. And I really should get back to making those sort of videos because I haven't done one in a while, and I do really enjoy doing them, but they just take effort and perhaps I'm being a bit lazy with them. Today I just want to kind of sit down and chat with you about my perception of the relationship of literature and cinema. Of course, I think from a bookish perspective, we oftentimes dread hearing that our favourite books are being adapted into a film, yet sometimes, I must say, the films actually are usually quite good. Of course, you do have exceptions, but if you try to treat the film as a different object than the book that it has derived from, you are able to see it as its own thing and able to enjoy it for what it actually is. So I have a collection of books here which perhaps seem a little bit at ends with each other, and perhaps I am just imagining a sort of link with them. But, I'm just going to go through them one by one and talk about how they are books that I enjoy, either as books about cinema or they are books that I enjoy in relation to cinema, if that makes sense. So let's start with the biggest book first, and that is this massive, hefty coffee table book about Wes Anderson. Now, I absolutely love Wes Anderson films. I think the first film of his I watched was the Darjeeling Project, and then since then I have loved every single film that he has created. I think I have a particular soft spot for Moonrise Kingdom. That will always be sort of in my heart. It was just one of those really beautiful films that was really cute, yet at the same time addressed like big ideas, and his filmic style is incredible. Now, this book sort of traces all of his films up to the date that it was published, so it doesn't have Isle of the Dogs, but it has all of his other ones up to that point, and it kind of just analyses his style by looking at stills of each films and sort of addressing them in an essay format, but also in sort of question and answer format, sort of the themes, the topics that he addresses with, and the way that he shoots his films. So you can see in this spread here, in this book, Matt Zoller, who has sort of edited, put together and written the text for this book, he takes a look at these pictures and then he sort of discusses the film as a whole, and then he discusses the stills as specific anchors for points of reference to other films or inspirations of Wes Anderson, but also points of reference to the sort of process that Wes Anderson went through to get these stills, and it was really interesting to see. And you can see here that this one is from Moonrise Kingdom. I also put one in from Fantastic Mr. Fox, because as that is an animated film, it requires some very different work to go into it, and it was absolutely fascinating to read the sort of inspirations behind it and the way that Wes Anderson worked in creating this piece. I absolutely love this book, and I don't think I've ever read it from page to page. It's one of those books that kind of is just around, and every now and then I'll pick it up and just flick through, I'll read a little bit. And you do find the relationship between literature and cinema, specifically in this book where it talks about sort of literature also and the role that storytelling plays within Wes Anderson's films, and the sort of the methods that Wes Anderson will tell a story, and not just by following a narrative, but within each shot you can also find a story within them, and I find that absolutely fascinating, and it makes you sort of appreciate Wes Anderson's work so much more, and of course put together in a book, it instills further that power that not only does the written word have, but the scene word. If you imagine a shot or a still from a film and the set and everything take away them as images and put them instead as words, and you see that they are almost books within themselves, and with each passing shot is the turning of a page. But then we have this one, which is Me and You and Memento and Fargo, How Independent Screenplays Works by J.J. Murphy. Now this is a collection of essays that analyse specific films, and only independent films, with of course Memento and Fargo, but plenty other ones. But what's really interesting is that this book, or the essays within them, are grouped together in sort of chapters almost that discuss a specific part of independent cinema and what we can learn from it. Now I'll give you an example of some of the titles of the essays. So for example, Part 2, which is multiple plot films. Chapter 4 is multiple plots and subplots in trust. Chapter 5 is shifting goals and plot lines in gas food lodging. And chapter 6, the ensemble structure of Me and You and Everyone We Knew. Now, what I like about this sort of collection of essays is that not only does it cater to my taste of analysing films, but this is actually a really great tool for writers also, to understand how specific like film auteurs have taken a story, and the process in which they are telling the story gives us as readers and perhaps aspiring writers, not only screenwriters but also book writers, ways of kind of looking at different facets of genre writing. So for example, in this one it gave you an essay which discusses ensemble casts and how did the telling of a narrative using an ensemble cast alter from telling a narrative of a very like linear story. There's a whole section on temporality in independent cinema, so how can you tell stories with using different modes of time? Do you use flashbacks, or do you use anti-chronological tale where you go backwards instead of forwards? And I think it's just a really helpful tool to better understand the way that other people tell stories and how you can then subsequently tell stories. So I feel that this one is a lot more explicit in what it's saying as opposed to the Wes Anderson book, but they ultimately do give you insights which are very similar in understanding films as stories and understanding the similarities between literature and the cinema. Now we're going to get a little bit more closer to actual like fiction and the role that fictional books play in relation to cinema. And I want to start it off by looking at The Tree of the Toraja by Philippe Claudel, in which I gave a review recently on my channel, and I'll link it down below if you haven't watched it yet. Now, I love this book, but what's interesting is that Philippe Claudel is also a filmmaker, and he has written films, and film plays a very important part in this book. Within this book, our narrator is constantly reflecting on the way that cinema and the stories within the cinema has impacted his own perspective on life. So it's really interesting seeing how within this book itself, both literature and cinema play a very similar role in shaping our narrator's perspective, but also knowing that the author himself is a filmmaker and a novelist and writer. He obviously kind of doesn't see a boundary between the role that cinema and literature can play, and the fact that he addresses them so similarly within this book and within his own life, and he practices them in ways that are entwined, really goes to show how closely linked film and literature is, and how they can both play a really important role in our understanding of the world around us and the way that we sort of interact and perceive the world, which I find absolutely fascinating, and I absolutely love this book and always will recommend it. So now I'm going to look at an interesting book-to-movie adaptation, and the book is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, and the film is, of course, Prisoner of Azkaban by Alfonso Cuarón. Now, of the films, Prisoner of Azkaban was probably my absolute favourite. Not in the fact that it stuck so closely to the book. There was lots of things that missed out from the book that just didn't happen to be in the film. But it's the fact that Alfonso Cuarón sort of rejected the notion of Harry Potter being an everyman book, and he sort of gave it an actual style, which you don't happen to see so much in the other films. Now, the first two films are very childlike, they're very fantastical, but they're kind of a little bit glossy and superficial. They kind of miss out on the true meaning of Harry Potter. However, I will give you the fact that they are very nostalgic. You are watching them, and even on your first watch, they just feel very nostalgic. But then as the films progress and they get darker, they also, again, lose a sense of style, I feel at least. And and they sort of become just very much bland, and that they're just trying to tell the story and just relying on CGI to help tell the story. Now, Prisoner of Azkaban also relied on CGI, as any fantasy film would, but Alfonso Cuarón was able to encapsulate a mood and a theme and a style that I think reflected the book so well. He didn't need to tell the story exactly as J.K. Rowling told it in order to tell the same story, if that makes sense. He was able to understand the motifs of this book and translate them into images in such a really beautiful way. The way that he sort of addresses the Dementors of this book is so dark and represents them in a way that is truly representative of the depression that J.K. Rowling said the Dementors symbolize. And even the coloration of the entire film depicts the color of this book. If a book has a color, it would be the color palette that you see in Prisoner of Azkaban for this one, because it emotes a mood, it emotes an idea and a concept, rather than specifically giving us scene by scene a recounting of word by word of this book. And I think I really appreciate that. And I think that when you see a lot of book to movie adaptations, you seldom find a director putting his own thumbprint on it as much as Alfonso Cuarón did. You seldom see a film director giving a very specific and unique style to a book that they perceive as being an everyman's book, a book for everyone to enjoy. But then you get a lot of people who love Prisoner of Azkaban the movie because of the fact that it had a style and because it had a mood, and it didn't shy away from trying to retain the book's story so tightly, but was able to kind of make it its own thing. And you should always look at film as its own thing when it's doing a book to film adaptation, because it's never going to be the book, because they are two completely different medias. So understanding that link and the way to translate a book into film, I think, is important. I think Alfonso Cuarón is one of the few directors who did it well. So that got me thinking about how filmic books can be without actually having a film adaptation. And I was wondering, what good book, because whilst I talk about bad books that could be made into better films, what good book would really work well in the sort of filmic genre, and with a director who wasn't afraid to sort of put his own thumbprint on it. So I was thinking Death in Spring would be absolutely perfect for a filmic representation of this story, because there is a loose narrative to this story, but it is also a very allegorical tale, and I think you can get a lot from this book that perhaps isn't necessarily written within this book, and it's all about your own experience being imagined through the narrator of this story. And I absolutely love the way that this book was told, and I think that gives a director a lot of opportunity to put their own style and their own spin on the story. They don't have to worry about keeping exactly word to word to what happens in this book, because they're almost like little scenes within themselves that don't necessarily have to be explicitly translated into film. Now, I was thinking again of, as I always do, what sort of film director would I enjoy adapting this sort of book, and I was thinking of Yorgos Lanthimos. He's a Greek director who he's probably well known for The Lobster, and I think, having watched Dogtooth and Lobster, and really excited to watch The Alps, which he's done also, he would be able to take the story, put his own sort of mood onto it, because Yorgos has a very specific feeling in his films, in that the characters always appear very passive, and that events just happen to them until the very end, when they become very active characters and they sort of juxtapose your idea of them in a way that's very interesting. And I feel that sort of notion of capturing a character in a very subtle way, in a very passive way, and having them within a world that is very much happening to them as opposed to them happening within that world, really would capture the themes and the sense of our narrator in this story kind of just passively wandering through a world that doesn't really make sense, yet does within this book. And you know, the lobster is the exact same. It's a fantasy world at the end of the day. It's a world that doesn't make sense. It's quirky, it's weird, and until the character towards the end sort of takes his fate into his own hands, that we begin to realise just like the reality of everything that the film has been telling us so far. And I think that's something that would happen so perfectly within this book. And if a film director took a book like this and was able to give it their own style, their own thumbprint, and make it their own thing, it would just be really enjoyable, really powerful in telling that story. So I think we have this notion of the way that book to film adaptations are, and we tend to, you know, lose faith in them. And I think, you know, that's fair enough. A lot of directors just don't have the guts to put their own spin on a story or to tell someone else's story in their own way. We start thinking about how can film as a completely different media tell the same story but in a completely different way, and not be afraid of our beloved stories being told in a way that is perhaps alien to us but still captures the meaning of the story. Because at the end of the day, stories are about humans, are about people and feelings and emotions and, you know, and events, and I think we don't have to have them directly translated for them to still have that same meaning to us. We can see them through the lens of somebody else's perception and still feel that same emotion that the book had, but just in a different way and laid out to us in a different way. So I think that's all I really wanted to talk about and sort of put out there, and I would be interested in other people's ideas about film to book adaptations, or the relationship between literature and film and the role that storytelling has within both medias. You can let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to get a conversation started about this, because I know a lot of booktubers here are actually really interested in cinema. So yeah, I know you all have opinions and I'd love to hear them. Thank you for watching. I hope this was interesting. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you liked it, you can always give me a thumbs up. And as always, you are more than welcome to subscribe if you haven't yet already. And I'll see you next time for another video. Bye bye.